Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video we're doing a deep dive into the Wheel of Time series. One of the biggest themes in the series is the relationship between men and women and masculinity and femininity. And in this video I'm going to talk about how those themes emerge within the story, within the narrative, and also within the magic system and the metaphysics of the Wheel of Time. In order to say everything that I want to say on this topic, obviously I'm going to have to talk about, the series pretty much start to finish. So consider this a spoiler warning, full spoilers, entire series. So if any of that stuff bothers you, please don't watch any further. Some of my review videos have already kind of mixed a bit of analysis with the just general reviewing of the book. But in this video, I'm really focusing on analysing the text, and this is the first time that I've done this in a full video. So please let me know in the comments, constructively, what do you think are good, what do you think are bad, so I can get better at these in the future. I also hope that my discussion here will also prompt some interesting conversations about the series as a whole, so also let me know what you think of my ideas in the comments below. Okay, let's get started. There are three parts to this video. In the first part we're going to talk about the idea of balance and how the idea of balance plays into the idea of gender and how gender is supposed to work in the Wheel of Time. In the second part we're going to move on and talk about Sayadin and Sayadar, the two halves of the magic system in the Wheel of Time, and again look at how these two things relate to each other in the narrative. In the third part of the video I'm then going to talk about specific characters and show how the magic system itself and the way the magic system works is oftentimes reflected in the development of certain characters. Mainly here I'm going to be focusing on Morena and Rand, but also the male and female characters more generally as well. With all that introduction spiel out of the way, let's get started. Part 1. Balancing the Wheel. The Wheel of Time stands out, maybe less so now, but definitely when it first came about, as a fantasy series that had a much broader scope in terms of the mythologies and philosophies that it was drawing from. You do have some Western influences, the idea of creation and the idea of a creator are things that are more in line with Judeo-Christian religion. You also have the drawing on Celtic mythology and Norse mythology as well, but one of the big differences with the Wheel of Time is it's influenced by much broader world religions and cultures as well. In fact, there's a pretty good argument that many of the central concepts in the series are ones that are actually from Eastern rather than Western mythology and religion. The ideas that are relevant for this video are the idea that time is circular, a never-ending cycle of death and rebirth for the characters in this world, and the idea that world needs a balance both of elemental forces, so you've got the 5 elements of the power, but also balance between men and women and also light and darkness. And these things you can definitely see more in Eastern mythology rather than Western, especially with religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, and you can definitely trace the influences there onto Jordan's work. The idea of balance to me is one of the key aspects or themes in the series overall. We can see this most obviously with the idea of light and darkness battling each other. Although throughout the novel, up until the end, the battle between the light and shadow is portrayed in a very adversarial way, at the end of the novel we realise that actually, in order for the world of the Wheel of Time to continue as it is, with people as they are, you actually need a balance of light and darkness within the world. In A Memory of Light, Rand's plan to defeat the Dark One is not just to seal him in prison again, but to actually try and vanquish him forever, thus eradicating darkness from the pattern. While he's battling the Dark One actually gives him a vision of what the world would be like if he succeeded in this aim. And Rand finds that a world without darkness is actually not the sort of world that he would like to live in. In the vision, he finds Elaine in Camelin, and he discovers that she has become a completely different person. The Dark Lord's words thundered against Rand. Aghast, he stepped away as Elaine rose, obviously concerned for him. Yes, he saw it now, the thing behind her eyes. She was not herself, because Rand had taken from her the ability to be herself. In a world without the forces of darkness, Rand realizes, people would lose their identities and their free will. The reason for this is that every character in the Wheel of Time is a combination of light and dark. There is no real force of light or force of darkness in terms of the actual people that are living in the world. Everyone has elements of both of these things. So if either of them get removed from the pattern, then people will lose their identities and sense of self and become completely different people. And we see this in the vision. Ultimately, Rand has to recognize that the battle between light and darkness will always go on, and that it has to go on if humanity is to continue as it is. One great thing about this ending is that it kind of subverts the light versus dark narrative that the Wheel of Time really seems to be a paradigm of. It seems to be a series that's very much good versus evil, and it still kind of is, but this change at the end, where Rand realises that you can't eradicate evil, and that evil is a part of everyone, kind of muddies the waters a bit in terms of the actual message of the book. Because in order to defeat the Dark One, Rand has to allow the Dark One to continue to influence the world. Ultimately, Rand, the protagonist, has to accept that the world is ultimately a grey, morally grey place, and good and evil will always have to exist together, fighting with each other, if he wants the world to exist as it is. So why am I talking about balance in terms of light and dark? This is not a video about this, it's about gender. The reason that I bring this topic up is because, one, the balancing thing really is clear when it comes to light and dark in the series, but it is something that is also mirrored in the gender relations in the series as well. Just as much as The Wheel of Time is a story about lightness and darkness, it's also a story about masculinity and femininity, and men and women, and the balance between these two things. In fact, these two themes run parallel to each other, because just as there is always a tension between light and darkness, there is a tension between these two kinds of gender, the masculine side and the feminine side. And in order for the novel to be resolved, or the series to be resolved, these two forces have to work together and unite with each other, rather than working completely against each other. So I bring that up because there's a nice parallel between these two things. This battle between men and women, and masculinity and femininity, comes in at several levels in the series. In the next part I'm going to talk about how it comes in at the level of the magic system, and then in the final part I'm going to talk about how it comes in at the level of the characters themselves, and the connections between these two things. Part 2. Saladin and Sayadar. So I don't want to get too much into a video about world building and getting into the nitty-gritties of the magic system, but there are some elements that I want to bring up about the magic system, so a bit of description of the magic system is going to be necessary, and I'm going to leave that to the following quote by Morena herself. The One Power comes from the true source, the driving force of creation, the force of the creator, made to turn the wheel of time. Saladin, the male half of the source, and Sayadar, the female half, work against each other and at the same time together to provide that force. So you have the true power, which is the kind of broad source of the power, and then within that you have a male side and a female side, and men can access the male side and females can access the female side. We also learn that only men can access the male side of the One Power, and only females can access the female side of the One Power. And what's more interesting than this is that the ways in which men and women access their respective sides of the power is very different again from each other. In The Shadow Rising, we get a nice conversation between Rand, Egwene, and Elaine, where they summarise these differences. Egwene describes mastering Sadar in the following way. I imagine myself to be a flower, a rosebud. Imagine it until I am the rosebud. The rosebud's petals open out into the light of Sayadar, and I let it fill me, all light and warmth of life and wonder. I surrender to it, and by surrendering, I control it. That was the hardest part to learn, really. How to master Sayadar by submitting. On the other hand, we have Rand describing his control of Saladin in a very different way. That's nothing like what I do. Let it fill me. I have to reach out and take hold of Saladin. Sometimes there's still nothing there when I do. Nothing I can touch. But if I didn't reach for it, I could stand there forever and nothing would happen. It fills me all right, once I take hold. But surrender to it. If I surrendered, even for a minute, Saladin would consume me. It's like a river of molten metal, an ocean of fire. I must fight to make it do what I want. So on the one hand, we have the way in which women control the power is by surrendering to it, to opening themselves up and allowing it to wash over them. Whereas for men to access the power, they have to grab it, take hold of it, and not let it control them, otherwise they'll be destroyed by it. So we can see here that Saladin and Sayadar work in very different ways from each other. And we can see from what Morena said that even though they work differently, they are still a part of a greater source, the true power, which is the thing that unites them. We also learn from Morena that these two sides of the source work together and also against each other. And it's this eternal conflict but also unification that is a core theme of the book. In order for the world to subsist, these two sides do have to sometimes work against each other, but primarily they need to be unified at a fundamental level, and it's only in this way that there can be balance. In the time in which the series takes place, the balance between Saladin and Sayadar has already been broken. This is because Saladin, the male half of the true source, has been tainted by the Dark One. This is something that happened in the previous age, the Age of Legends, when the Dark Lord tried to rise and was defeated by the Dragon Reborn. That defeat came at a great cost, the cost being that the Dark One was able to touch the male half of the True Source and corrupt it, condemning all male channelers to go insane. In order to avoid the destruction of the world, called the Breaking of the World in the series, the female channelers had to round up the male channelers and either kill them or do something called gentling, which is when you take away someone's ability to channel, to stop the madness and to stop the world from collapsing. Thus, at the start of the novel, we have a world in which the masculine force and the feminine force are completely out of balance because the male half has been corrupted. It's noted in the series that during the Age of Legends, before Saiyajin was tainted, male and female channelers were able to work together to create a world which was technologically very advanced and also very socially advanced. The world of the Age of Legends is described as being very similar to our world, but probably even better than that because they have magic and can do loads of cool stuff that we can't do. The idea is, in the world at which these two forces are balanced with one another, you have a world which is much greater, much more effective, and much more peaceful than a world like the series is when we enter the series, where you have the two forces out of balance and a medieval world that's very backwards, people don't really know very much, and all of these great wonders from the previous age are just completely lost because they're unable to understand, because they lack balance in the world. This idea of balancing the two sides of the one power is a key arc in the series as a whole. Many of the most significant successes in the series are successes in which male channelers, usually Rand, and female channelers, whether that's Morena and Rand in the early series or Nynaeve and Rand in the later series, when they work together, they're able to do great things. For instance, when Rand and Nynaeve get together to cleanse the taint from Saiyajin, thus allowing men to channel again, they're only able to do this because they work together. And this is a key thing that recurs throughout the series as a whole. Men and women need to use the powers together in order to succeed. This idea of balance between Saiyajin and Sayadaw, masculine and feminine, is basically a mirror of the idea of balance in the case of the shadow and the light, and what Rand ultimately realizes about those forces at the end of the Memory of Light. The conflict between these different forces is a necessary part of existence. You can't necessarily eradicate the conflict, but at the same time, you have to always make sure that one side isn't going to overwhelm the other, because once one side of the conflict is destroyed, the world is thrown off balance and basically collapses. Just as a world dominated by too much darkness or too much light would be a bad thing, so too is a world where the masculine or feminine forces have dominance over the other. What we need to try and have is a balance within the tension between the two. Part 3. Male and female characters. So, I was a bit skeptical about not skeptical, but I was a bit worried about making this video because a lot of people I've read in reviews can be pretty vocal about not liking the gender politics of the Wheel of Time. A lot of people point out that the female characters especially seem to be incredibly aggressive and sexist in their treatment of men. And while that is certainly the case, there's definitely a lot of men not understanding women and women not understanding men throughout this book. I think that all of this is very deliberate and has a point. And so, even if as a reader it can be frustrating to have these this strong antagonism between the sexes, it actually makes sense in the series, and the way that the series concludes, it seems as though those problems are ones that would actually go away in the future. So in this part I want to talk about the particular gender conflicts going on in the series between the actual characters in the series, as opposed to just talking about the magic system and abstract concepts. Also, the fundamental message is again the same thing that it was in the case of Light and Darkness, Saiyajin and Sayadaw. It's the same with men and women as human beings. They have to work together in order to make a better world. In the current timeline, when we begin the book, the world of the Wheel of Time is one in which women have a disproportionate amount of power in comparison to the men. This is most true in the case of the Aes Sedai. The world of the Wheel of Time now is one in which men can't channel safely, and so they are gentled or killed if they do something really dangerous. And so you have a very powerful organisation of female channelers having a great amount of power and influence over the world, and no corresponding male organisation. But it's not just to do with the Aes Sedai either. We also see in positions of leadership in the Wheel of Time, and this actually is a good thing in the series, I think, a lot of women in power. In fact, some cities like Camelin only elect female leaders. Now this isn't to say that men don't hold positions of power in the Wheel of Time, because there are many leaders in the Wheel of Time series. It's just to point out that in terms of the balance between the two, the Wheel of Time is a world in which women seem to be more trusted as leaders than men. And this makes sense when you consider the history of the Wheel of Time. It's also a world in which women have a lot of negative attitudes towards men, and sometimes are not particularly willing to allow men in positions of power. And we see this especially in the case of Morena and Rand. Even though Rand is the Dragon Reborn who will defeat the Dark One, in the early parts of the series, Morena doesn't trust Rand with the power that he has. She very much wants to control him, and so do the Aes Sedai at the White Tower, because men just can't be trusted with power. And this makes sense, again, when you consider that history. The reason why the breaking of the world happened was because men went insane with the power that they had, and because of the taint, and so started destroying shit. So, naturally, you're going to have to, one, eradicate the male channelers, and that's going to have a detrimental effect on how people view men in the future. And it seems that the Wheel of Time, when we begin the series, is a world in which people are still, even if not necessarily consciously, they're still affected by that damage that was done. And that's causing them to have, say, negative attitudes about men, very tense relations between the genders, and also seems to be a good reason for why there tend to be more women in positions of power and authority. The fundamental reason, though, why the world was broken was something that can be attributed really, not necessarily to a particular gender, but to a refusal on both sides to work together. Lewis Theron, the dragon at the time, he had a plan to seal the Dark One's prison, and the male channelers were up for that, and the female channelers were not, and so they refused to join the male channelers when they went to seal the Dark One's prison. And it was then that the Dark One was able, while the men were doing this, to touch Sayidine and taint it, thus causing men to go mad and the breaking to happen, and all that terrible stuff. Now, the men in the series, or some of the men in the series, blame the whole thing on women and their unwillingness to take risks, and maybe even their cowardice, and the women blame it on men and man's arrogance. But I think these conflicts and these petty kind of jabs are not really the real reason why things didn't work out, and why the terrible things happened. Ultimately then, the reason that the breaking of the world happened was because men and women, male channelers, female channelers, were unwilling to work together. And whenever there is this unwillingness to work together, we see in the series, that is when things go wrong, whereas when there is willingness to work together, things go right, as we see when Rand and Nynaeve ultimately cleanse the taint from Sayidine. They do that by working together. And when Rand ultimately defeats the Dark One, it isn't just him there doing that. He's with Moraine and Nynaeve, and it's only with the combined efforts of men and women that they can actually destroy the Dark One. Another thing that I really like about the gender relations in the book and how the characters relate to each other is how these things are mirrored in the way that Sayidine and Sayadar work. We actually see in the psychologies of some of the characters at least, their internal struggles are very similar to the ways in which they would access the respective parts of the power that they use. And the two characters that I want to talk about here are Moraine, because there's a very explicit connection made between her psychological progression and how a woman would control Sayadar, and Rand, and how a man would control Sayidine. So in Book 5, The Fires of Heaven, Moraine has got to a point where she's trying to control Rand, but Rand is now asserting his authority more, he's got the respect of the Aiel, and so he isn't really willing to be led by her anymore, and he doesn't trust her because she's always trying to manipulate and control him. In a pivotal scene, in one of the big scenes in terms of character development, but also in the series altogether, Moraine actually submits to Rand and says, "Look, I will promise to not do this anymore, to control you, if you'll just listen to me. Do you want an oath to try not manipulating you? I give it." Her voice hardened to crystal. "I even swear to obey you like one of the maidens, like one of the Gaishain, if you require. But you must." Taking a deep breath, she began again, more softly. I ask you humbly, to allow me to help you." So in this scene we have Moraine willingly submitting to Rand in order to still have that influence over him. But then later on she makes an explicit connection to Sayadar, making this metaphor between her psychological struggles and how women control Sayadar very explicit. Egwene made ready to go, but first she had a question. "Moraine, why have you started doing everything Rand tells you to? Even Nynaeve doesn't think it is right." "She does not, does she?" Moraine murmured. "She will be Aes Sedai yet, whatever she wishes." "Why?" "Because I remembered how to control Sayadar." After a moment, Egwene nodded. "To control Sayadar, first you had to surrender to it." From this point on, Moraine is able to not only, I wouldn't say she's able to control Rand, but she's able to work together with Rand and have a great deal of influence over what he does. And she becomes one of his most trusted advisors. This setup also has a huge payoff later on in A Memory of Light, when Morena returns, and she is one of the people that Rand chooses to go with him, along with Nynaeve, to destroy the Dark One. Because in the novel, the female characters, especially the female Aes Sedai, have a lot of power, and throughout the course of the novel we see men, especially when the taint on saidin is destroyed, gaining power. Many of the women have to learn to surrender some of the power that they have in order to work together with the male characters. And that's reflected beautifully in the way that saidar works. In order to control the power, in order to harness this huge, vast power that can do so many wonderful things, you have to surrender to it. And that's something that's mirrored in the psychological development of the female characters in the story. We see a parallel thing happening with male characters, particularly Rand, and the relation to how men are able to control saidin. So Rand has a consistent problem throughout the series, especially with the female characters, which is that, well, I wouldn't even say just the female characters really, it's more just the female Aes Sedai, where he's not able to assert himself with them. We see this with Moraine in the first 5 books, where she's trying to control him and he has to assert himself. And then, obviously, Moraine disappears for a bit, and so we end up with Cass Swain, who plays a similar sort of role to Moraine, although I think she's a lot worse in terms of the way she really doesn't really give Rand the time of day or respect that probably should have had, really. And so Rand has to constantly battle and fight against everyone in order to have the position of power that he needs to do what he needs to do. Again, this is mirrored really well with saidin and how you control saidin. You can't just sit there and let these overwhelming forces wash over you, because then you'll be destroyed by it. If Rand stops fighting at any moment in the book, he'll be caught in Aes Sedai plots, or the plots of the political leaders who are constantly manoeuvring around him. Or of course, he may even lose his own sense of identity, because he has the internal stuff going on with voices in his head, and again, he needs to fight against these things constantly in order to maintain control. And that's really well reflected in saidin and the way that saidin works. I think it's really clever the way that the magic system, saidin and saidar, are reflected in the internal psychologies of the characters in the Wheel of Time series. I also think that bearing this stuff in mind, it allows me to appreciate why the characters have this conflict with each other. But what matters is that through the course of the series, men and women learn that if they want to defeat the Dark One, if they want to, return to a time like the Age of Legends, they have to put aside that fragmentation. They have to work together with each other. Even if, fundamentally, there will always be these kind of underlying tensions going on. Which again we see reflected in the magic system, which has a male and female side that are always working against each other, but they also need to work together as well. Part 4, Conclusion. For me, ultimately the most interesting conflict in the Wheel of Time is not really the conflict between the light and the dark, but it's the conflict between men and women, masculinity and femininity. These issues are addressed within the narrative at so many levels. First of all, you have the magic system itself, which has a male and female half, working together and against each other to create the one power. But it also comes in at the level of the world itself and the narrative. Many of the key failures in the book come about because men and women refuse to work together, and many of the great successes occur when they do work together. In the world of the Wheel of Time, when we come into the story, we have a world where there is fragmentation between the sexes, and this fragmentation and tension is something that continues to last throughout the entire series, up until A Memory of Light. I would say that the moment of resolution for this tension comes in at one of the more controversial parts of A Memory of Light, which is in this conflict between Egwene and Rand, which, while yes, I don't think that was set up in the way that, the best possible way, because that was a conflict that could have been resolved if people just communicated slightly better, it is actually a very important part of that book, because it's at this point in the book where Egwene and Rand are potentially, they're at odds with each other, and you may end up with a situation where Egwene says she's not going to help Rand, and so Rand would have to go tackle the Dark One on his own, and we saw how that happened in the previous age when the women refused to work with the men, and it was a disaster. So actually that's a key part of the book, and it is when Moraine comes back and does her whole speech and is able to get them to work together that we then get the happy-ish ending that we get in the Wheel of Time. Okay, that's it for today's video. Please let me know in the comments what you thought of this and if you'd like to see more kind of analysis videos in the future. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Take care everyone, I'll see you all in the next video.